There is a locomotive sitting in a museum in South Africa that holds a secret most of the world has never heard. It does not look like a machine that changed anything. Its paint is faded. Its metal carries the honest wear of decades. Visitors walk past it without stopping because nothing about it announces itself as significant. It has no streamlining, no dramatic silhouette, none of the visual theater that makes people reach for cameras. But in 1981, on a stretch of track in the Karoo Desert, that locomotive ran tests that produced numbers the engineers recording them had to check 3 times before they believed what they were seeing. Fuel consumption figures that were better than diesel. Power output that exceeded anything a locomotive of its age and class had any right to produce. Performance numbers that, had they been taken seriously by anyone with the authority to act on them, might have changed the history of steam traction entirely. They were not taken seriously. The locomotive was retired. The engineer who built it spent the rest of his working life trying to convince railroads on 4 continents to let him do it again. None of them did. The technology he had proven sat documented in reports that almost nobody read, available to anyone who asked, waiting for a world that never came back to collect it. This is the story of the Red Devil. It is the story of what happens when a single extraordinary mind solves a problem that an entire industry has decided is not worth solving anymore. And it is the story of what it costs to be right at the wrong moment, in the wrong place, with the wrong result. To understand why the Red Devil existed at all, you have to understand South Africa in the 1970s. The country was not like the United States or Great Britain, where the transition to diesel was driven primarily by economics and the mechanical limitations of steam technology. South Africa had a different problem and a different calculation to make. South Africa had coal. Enormous reserves of it, some of the largest in the world, scattered across the Highveld and the eastern provinces in seams so thick and accessible that the cost of extraction was almost nothing compared to what fuel cost anywhere else. The railroad had been built on coal. The country's industrial economy ran on coal. Coal was cheap, plentiful, and entirely domestic. You did not need to import it. You did not need to negotiate its price with foreign suppliers, and you did not need to worry about the currency fluctuations and political instabilities that made petroleum a constant source of anxiety for the governments and companies that depended on it. Diesel fuel, on the other hand, had to be imported. Every diesel locomotive was a commitment to a supply chain that extended outside the country's borders and was vulnerable to exactly the kinds of external pressures that South Africa, given its political situation in those decades, had every reason to want to avoid. This created a situation that was unique in the industrialized world. South African railways had genuinely good reasons to keep steam running. Not merely sentimental reasons, not inertia or resistance to change, but a hard-edged economic logic that made the question of diesel versus steam more complicated than it was anywhere else. And yet South African Railways was switching to diesel anyway. The reason was the same one that had defeated steam everywhere else it had tried to compete. Not fuel cost, operating cost. The daily reality of maintaining steam locomotives at the scale a modern railroad required was simply too expensive in labor, too demanding in specialized skills, too unforgiving in the complexity of keeping thousands of components working in coordination across thousands of miles of track. The diesel was winning not because its fuel was cheaper in South Africa, where it was actually more expensive than coal, but because everything else about operating it was easier, more predictable, and more compatible with the direction that industrial management was moving. By the mid-1970s, the diesel was winning this argument in South Africa as completely as it had won everywhere else. Into this situation came David Wardale. Wardale was a British engineer, trained in the rigorous classical tradition of British steam locomotive design, who had come to South Africa to work for South African Railways. He was, by every account of people who worked with him, a man of almost unsettling technical precision, combined with a deep, almost philosophical conviction that the limits people accepted as fixed were usually anything but. He had arrived in South Africa at a moment when most engineers with his training and background were accepting, however reluctantly, that the steam era was ending. The diesels were coming. The calculations were clear. You could argue about specific numbers, dispute particular comparisons, find individual routes or operating conditions where steam still made a favorable case for itself. But the overall direction was not in doubt. Wardale looked at this situation and reached a different conclusion. His conclusion was not that the diesel was wrong exactly. His conclusion was that the comparison being made was profoundly unfair, because the steam technology being compared to modern diesel had not advanced significantly since the 1930s. The theoretical understanding of thermodynamics, of heat transfer, of combustion efficiency, all of it had progressed enormously since the classic steam designs of the pre-war era. But almost none of that knowledge had been incorporated into the locomotives that railroads were actually operating. Steam design had effectively frozen itself at a moment when the technology was perhaps halfway to where it could theoretically go, and then the industry had walked away. Wardale knew about this gap between theoretical possibility and practical reality, in part because of an Argentinian engineer he had studied with an almost obsessive thoroughness. Livio Dante Porta was one of the most original minds in the history of steam engineering and one of the least known outside a small circle of specialists. Porta had spent decades developing what he called the Porta system, a comprehensive set of improvements to steam locomotive design that addressed, with rigorous thermodynamic analysis, every major source of inefficiency in conventional steam technology. His work covered combustion, the way fuel actually burned inside a firebox, and why conventional fireboxes wasted an enormous fraction of their potential heat. It covered steam generation, how water became steam, and why the process was far less efficient than it should have been in standard designs. It covered exhaust systems, the way steam was released from the cylinders after it had done its work, and the complex aerodynamic interactions that governed how efficiently the locomotive could breathe. Porta had applied these principles to a series of South American locomotives and demonstrated improvements in thermal efficiency that conventional engineers found almost impossible to believe. Fuel consumption reductions of 30% were documented, in some cases more, numbers that required checking and rechecking because they implied capabilities that standard locomotive theory said were unachievable. Wardale had absorbed everything Porta had published, corresponded with him directly, and arrived at a conviction that the conventional steam locomotive was operating at perhaps 40 or 50% of its theoretical potential. Not because the physics demanded this limitation, but because the designs had been developed by trial and error over decades, with practical constraints and engineering conservatism baking in inefficiencies that nobody had gone back to systematically eliminate. He wanted to build a locomotive that applied everything Porta's work had shown was possible. He wanted to prove, with hard data on a real railroad in real operating conditions, that advanced steam technology could compete with diesel not just in theory, but in the daily reality of service. What he needed was a locomotive to work with, and the permission to do something radical to it. South African Railways gave him both, though with the limited enthusiasm of an organization that considered the project a minor experiment rather than a major initiative. The locomotive selected was a Class 25 NC, built in the 1950s by the North British Locomotive Company, one of a large fleet that South African Railways operated on its non-electrified lines. The Class 25 NC was a solid conventional design, competent without being exceptional, representative of the mainstream steam technology of its era. It was not an experimental machine or a prestige project, it was a working locomotive, chosen partly because the class had enough examples in service that one could be spared for an extended rebuild without disrupting operations. The locomotive chosen was number 3450. Wardale received it in a state that was, charitably, well used. Years of service in demanding conditions had taken their toll on the machine in ways that went beyond normal wear. It was functional, but it was a long way from the optimized state that his planned modifications would require as a starting point. The rebuild took years of preparation and months of physical work. Wardale operated largely without a large team or substantial budget. This was not a project like the Pennsylvania Railroad's T1 development, with the resources of a major corporation behind it and teams of specialists available on demand. This was one man, with a small group of collaborators, applying extraordinary analytical rigor to a practical problem with tools and materials available at a regional railway workshop. The changes Wardale made to number 3450 were comprehensive but not immediately visible. The locomotive's external appearance was not dramatically altered. There was no aerodynamic shrouding, no streamlining, no attempt to make the machine look different from its conventional origins. The changes were internal, thermodynamic, a systematic assault on every mechanism by which energy was being wasted. The firebox was redesigned. The combustion process in a conventional locomotive firebox is far less complete than it appears. Fuel burns, heat is generated, steam is produced, but a significant fraction of the fuel's potential energy leaves through the chimney as unburned gases and particles, or is lost through the walls of the firebox in ways that better insulation could prevent. Wardale applied Porta's combustion theory to produce a firebox that burned its fuel more completely and lost less of the resulting heat before it could be transferred to the water. The exhaust system was completely rebuilt. This element of steam locomotive design is less intuitive than it might seem. The exhaust blast from a locomotive's cylinders serves a purpose beyond simply expelling spent steam. It creates the draft that pulls air through the firebox and maintains the combustion process. Get this wrong and you get a locomotive that either cannot maintain its fire properly at high outputs or wastes enormous amounts of energy generating more draft than the firebox actually needs. Porta had developed sophisticated analytical methods for optimizing this system. Wardale applied them. Feed heating systems, lubrication systems, valve gear geometry, Every element of the locomotive was examined against the theoretical ideal and adjusted where adjustment was possible. The work was meticulous in a way that bordered on the obsessive, because Wardale understood that improvements of 5% here and 3% there were not just additive. In a thermodynamic system, improvements in one area made improvements in adjacent areas more effective. The gains compounded. When the work was complete, number 3450 was painted red. The crews who worked with it started calling it the Red Devil. The first test runs on the Karoo lines produced data that the engineers reading the instruments genuinely did not know how to process. South African Railways had detailed performance records for the Class 25 NC fleet going back years. They knew exactly what a standard Class 25 NC could do in normal service, what loads it could haul, what speeds it could maintain, what fuel it consumed per mile and per ton. These numbers were well established and represented the best performance achievable with the conventional design. The Red Devil's numbers were not comparable. They were from a different category. Tractive effort, the force with which a locomotive can pull its train, was dramatically higher than the standard locomotive. This was expected from the modifications, at least in direction, if not in precise magnitude. What was less expected was what happened to fuel consumption at the same time. In conventional steam designs, pushing toward higher power output means pushing toward higher fuel consumption at roughly the same rate. More power costs more fuel, almost linearly. The Red Devil's fuel consumption, measured against the work it was doing, was lower than the standard Class 25 NC at comparable power outputs. You were getting more pulling force from less coal. The fundamental thermodynamic efficiency of the machine, the fraction of the coal's energy that was actually being converted into useful work rather than escaping as waste heat or unburned gases, had increased substantially. By how much? The measured figures varied by test and by operating conditions, as they always do with locomotive testing, which involves too many variables to produce perfectly clean data. But across multiple tests and multiple conditions, the improvement in thermal efficiency was documented at somewhere between 30 and 40% compared to the unmodified locomotive. 30 to 40%. In a world where major engineering programs with enormous budgets struggled to achieve improvements measured in single-digit percentages, one man with a modest budget and a regional workshop had delivered 30 to 40% in a single rebuild. The implications, if you took them seriously, were remarkable. If a locomotive that was 40 years old, representing essentially frozen 1940s technology, could be improved by 30 to 40% through the systematic application of thermodynamic knowledge that had been available for decades, what could be achieved with a new locomotive designed from scratch with these principles incorporated from the beginning? What could be achieved if the Porta system was applied not as a retrofit to an existing design, but as the foundation of an entirely new machine? The comparison to diesel, which South African Railways engineers had considered closed, suddenly looked much less clear. The Red Devil was not just competitive with diesel in fuel cost terms. In South Africa, where coal was cheap and diesel fuel expensive, it was dramatically cheaper to run. The efficiency improvements had not just closed the gap that had existed when steam was burning fuel wastefully. They had shifted the comparison in steam's favor. This was the moment when everything should have changed. It did not change. The reasons that South African Railways declined to pursue what the Red Devil had demonstrated are worth understanding, because they are not simple. The most obvious reason, and the one that gets cited most frequently, is institutional momentum. South African Railways had committed to diesel. The infrastructure for diesel maintenance was being built. The training programs for diesel mechanics were running. The procurement processes, the maintenance schedules, the operational planning, all of it had been organized around the transition to diesel. Reversing that commitment would not just mean building more Red Devils, it would mean dismantling a program of institutional change that had been years in the making. This is real, but it is not sufficient as an explanation, because institutions do reverse course when the evidence is compelling enough and the stakes are high enough. If the Red Devil had demonstrated results that were slightly better than expected, momentum might have been enough to override the data. But the Red Devil's results were not slightly better than expected. They were in a different category. The deeper reason was less about momentum and more about trust. The railroad's engineering leadership looked at Wardale's results and did not know what to do with them. The numbers were too good. They implied improvements that exceeded what conventional steam theory said should be achievable, which meant either that Wardale had made measurement errors or that the conventional theory was substantially wrong. Neither option was comfortable. If the measurements were wrong, the whole project was a waste of time and money, and the engineers who had signed off on it would look foolish. If the measurements were right and conventional theory was wrong, the implications were even more uncomfortable. It meant that the engineering consensus that had guided locomotive design for decades was significantly mistaken, and that the decision to abandon steam, made on the basis of that consensus, might have been premature. Neither conclusion was one that institutional decision-makers were eager to reach. There was also the practical question of what acting on the results would actually require. Building a fleet of advanced steam locomotives from scratch, incorporating everything the Red Devil had demonstrated, was not a small modification to existing plans. It was a fundamental reversal of direction, requiring new design work, new manufacturing processes, and a willingness to bet that the results achieved on one rebuilt prototype would translate reliably to mass-produced new machines. That bet might well have been correct, but it was a bet, and the people asked to make it had not been given sufficient reason to trust that Wardale's analysis of why the improvements had worked was complete and transferable. Wardale, to his credit, understood the problem. He spent years after the Red Devil tests producing detailed documentation of exactly what had been done and why. An engineering record so comprehensive that anyone with the knowledge to read it could understand not just what had been achieved, but the theoretical basis for every change. He was not trying to protect a proprietary secret or maintain personal control over the technology. He was trying to hand it over, clearly and completely, to anyone who would take it. Nobody took it. What followed the Red Devil project was one of the stranger stories in 20th century engineering, the story of a proven technology looking for a home and not finding one. Wardale left South Africa and spent years approaching railroad organizations across the world with his documentation, his analysis, his test results, and his proposal that a modern steam locomotive designed from first principles using Porta's thermodynamic methods could be built that would genuinely compete with diesel on economic terms, not just in places with cheap coal, but potentially in broader applications. He approached railways in Europe. He approached organizations in North America. He engaged with preservation groups, with academic institutions, with anyone who had both the technical sophistication to understand what he was proposing and the resources to potentially pursue it. The responses he received fell into a few predictable categories. Some organizations were politely interested but institutionally incapable of acting. They had no mandate to pursue new steam technology, no budget for experimental development, no one with authority to commit to something so far outside their normal operations. Some were skeptical of the data. The improvements Wardale claimed for the Red Devil exceeded what respected steam engineers had thought achievable. And while his documentation was thorough, the skeptics were not prepared to accept results that challenged established theory without independent verification that nobody was willing to fund. Some simply could not see the point. Steam was over. Everyone knew steam was over. It had been over for 30 years. Whatever the numbers said about one experimental locomotive in South Africa, the practical reality was that the world had moved on. The infrastructure had changed, the expertise had dispersed, and rebuilding the industrial ecosystem that would be needed to operate a new fleet of steam locomotives was not feasible regardless of the thermodynamics. There was a project in Britain, years later, called the 5AT, an attempt to design an advanced steam locomotive along the lines Wardale had developed, capable of high-speed passenger service on modern tracks. Wardale was involved in the technical work. The project produced detailed designs and serious engineering analysis. It did not produce a locomotive. Funding never materialized at the scale required, and the organizations that might have supported it were not convinced the investment was justified. The Red Devil itself was eventually retired from service and eventually made its way to a museum, where it sits today, carrying no external indication of what makes it different from any other old locomotive standing on display. Its paint is faded. Visitors walk past without stopping. Wardale eventually wrote a book. He had always been a writer in the engineering sense, someone who documented his work with exceptional precision and clarity. But this was something different. It was a comprehensive account of everything he had done, everything he had proved, and everything he believed could be achieved with steam technology if the knowledge were ever taken seriously and applied at scale. The book is called The Red Devil and Other Tales from the Age of Steam. It is not an easy read. It is long, technically dense, and written in the patient, detailed style of a man who has spent years trying to explain something that people keep failing to understand, and has concluded that the only solution is to explain it more completely and more precisely than anyone could reasonably object to. Among the people who read it are engineers who come away convinced that Wardale is correct in every substantial claim he makes. That the thermodynamic case for advanced steam, properly designed and operated, is solid. That the Red Devil tests demonstrated real improvements achieved through real physics, not measurement error or optimistic interpretation. That a new steam locomotive designed from first principles along the lines Porta and Wardale developed would perform in ways that the locomotives the industry walked away from never came close to. Those engineers have generally not been in positions to do anything with this conviction. The railroad industry did not walk away from steam because steam was theoretically impossible to improve. It walked away from steam because improving it would have required starting over. And at the moment when the decision was made, starting over was more expensive and uncertain than switching to diesel. By the time Wardale proved that starting over was worthwhile, the industry had moved too far along the diesel path to turn back without costs that nobody was willing to bear. This is the trap that Wardale's work fell into, and it is a trap that is not unique to steam locomotives. The history of technology is full of solutions that arrived correctly but too late, that were proven sound after the window for implementation had closed, that sat documented and waiting while the world built itself around different choices. The correct timing for Wardale's work would have been the 1930s. If the Porta system had been developed and proven in the 1930s, when the decision between steam and diesel was still genuinely open, when the infrastructure investment in steam was still current and the expertise still widespread, the outcome might have been different. Not certainly different. The diesel had real advantages beyond fuel consumption that would have remained relevant, but different enough that the comparison would have been close, and a close comparison might have kept steam in serious competition for another decade or two, long enough for different decisions to be made in different places. Instead, the work was done in the 1970s and 1980s, when the decision had been made, and the proof arrived to an audience that had moved on and was not coming back. There is a detail about the Red Devil that Wardale recounts in his documentation that is worth dwelling on. During the test period, when the locomotive was producing its extraordinary performance numbers on the Karoo lines, one of the South African Railways officials who came to observe the testing was asked what he thought of what he was seeing. His response was something to the effect that it was very impressive, but the problem was that people did not believe in steam anymore. Not that steam did not work, not that the numbers were wrong, not that there was a technical flaw in what Wardale had done. People did not believe in steam anymore. This is a different kind of failure from the ones that end most engineering projects. It is not a failure of the technology. It is a failure of persuasion, of timing, of the social and institutional context in which the technology has to live. A locomotive that performs better than expected but cannot overcome the assumption that such performance is impossible is in a peculiar position. The proof is there. The instruments recorded it. The documentation exists. But proof is not the same as belief, and in institutions run by people who have to take responsibility for decisions made on uncertain evidence, belief matters as much as proof. Wardale could demonstrate that the Red Devil worked. He could not demonstrate, to the satisfaction of people who had not stood beside the locomotive and watched the instruments, that it would continue to work in other circumstances, at other times, built by other people in other workshops, operated across an entire network rather than tested on a selected route. The leap from one rebuilt prototype to a policy of fleet construction is enormous, and no amount of documentation fully bridges it. Someone has to believe, and the people with the power to act had stopped believing in steam before the Red Devil ever turned a wheel. What the Red Devil ultimately represents is a proof of concept that the world was not equipped to use. This is not the same as saying the world was wrong not to use it. The argument for diesel was not based on ignorance of steam's theoretical potential. It was based on the practical reality of operating large railroad networks with available technology, available labor, available budget, and available time. The conventional steam locomotive really was more expensive and more difficult to maintain than diesel, even if it did not have to be. The Porta system really did require expertise and attention that was not easily scaled across an industry that was already struggling with the specialized demands of conventional steam. Whether a determined commitment to advanced steam development, starting in the 1940s or 1950s, could have produced a technology that competed successfully with diesel is a question that history has left unanswered and probably unanswerable. What can be said is that the commitment was never made, and that when one engineer demonstrated what such a commitment might have produced, the moment for commitment had already passed. David Wardale spent his career chasing something that mattered enormously to him, and that he had, by any reasonable technical standard, proven was achievable. The world looked at what he had proven and concluded that it had arrived too late to be useful, which is a different thing from being wrong. The distinction between too late and wrong is something the history of technology encounters often. It is small comfort to the people who devoted their working lives to demonstrating the former while being treated as if they had done the latter. The Red Devil sits in a museum in South Africa. The Porta system sits in books and reports that are available to anyone who searches for them. The case that advanced steam technology was never given a genuine chance to compete on equal terms with diesel is documented more thoroughly than almost any equivalent argument in the history of transportation. None of this is enough to change what happened. Steam is gone from the world's main lines. The last regular steam working on a significant national railroad faded out in the 1980s and 1990s, replaced by diesel and electric traction with an inevitability that felt, by the end, like natural law. The expertise dispersed. The infrastructure was repurposed. The industrial ecosystem that would have been needed to support a new generation of steam locomotives exists now only in fragments, in preservation societies and heritage railways, and the workshops of enthusiasts who maintain old machines for the love of the thing, rather than any expectation that the thing will return to commercial service. Wardale's numbers are still correct. The thermodynamics did not change. The improvements the Red Devil demonstrated were real, and they remain real, documented in records that any qualified engineer can examine and verify. If you built a new steam locomotive tomorrow, applying everything that Porta and Wardale worked out, you would almost certainly produce a machine that performed roughly as they predicted. But building that locomotive would require rebuilding an entire industrial world around it, and that world is not coming back. The story of the Red Devil is, among other things, a story about timing, about the difference between solving a problem and solving it at the right moment, about what it means to prove something true in a world that has already organized itself around a different answer. It is also, in a quieter way, a story about one engineer's refusal to accept that what had not been tried was the same as what could not be done. Wardale looked at the conventional wisdom of his profession, found it insufficient, and spent years of his life demonstrating precisely how and by how much it was insufficient. He was right. He was also not able to do anything with being right. There are people who find this story inspiring. There are people who find it heartbreaking. Possibly it is both. The Red Devil proved that steam could have been different. It could not prove that different was still possible. Sometimes the most important thing a machine can do is demonstrate what might have been, not to change the future which has already been decided, but to preserve the truth of what was possible, so that the people who come after have the full record of what was tried and what was abandoned and what was never given the chance it deserved. That locomotive in the museum is not just an old steam engine. It is a document. It is the evidence that the verdict history delivered on steam was not the only verdict available, that a different choice was possible, and that the choice was never really made so much as it was defaulted into by exhaustion and institutional inertia and the simple, brutal arithmetic of too late. The Red Devil did not save steam, but it proved, beyond any technical doubt, that steam could have been saved. That is a different kind of legacy, smaller in its practical consequences perhaps, but more honest. The most important things are sometimes the ones that demonstrate what humanity chose not to do, and why, and what was lost when the choice was made. The fire in the Red Devil went out decades ago. The argument it was making has never been answered.